Hi, I'm Moji Alawodeyal from the Feminist Buzzkills Live Pod, the only podcast that helps you navigate the news in this post-Roe anti-abortion hellscape. Each week, with co-host Liz Winstead, we dissect all the news from that sketchy intersection of abortion and misogyny with providers and activists working on the ground. The cherry on top is we have amazing comedy guests who help us laugh through the rage. Feminist Buzzkills Live drops Fridays wherever you pod. Listen and subscribe, because when BS is popping, we pop off.
It's no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, Unspun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to Unspun today. Unspun, because you deserve the truth.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's Unspun. I'm bringing back a detecting deception this week because there was a doozy. Then, did you know that your own local newspaper may be edited in a central office in a completely different part of the country? Or that a newspaper group that owns 32 publications across the state of Oregon may only employ 60 journalists across all of them? We'll get into the substantial shift of professional journalism into freelancing. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Okay, first the doozy. This week, President Trump decided to undo an important rule that had been created when Barack Obama was president. That rule, made in 2009, said that certain greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide, things that warm the planet, were dangerous for people's health. Because of that rule, the government was allowed to take legal and policy action to reduce pollution, especially from cars. The Trump administration said that removing the rule would be the biggest cut to regulations in U.S. history. They argued that it would make cars cheaper to build, saying car companies would save about $2,400 for each vehicle. But environmental groups are concerned. The government sent Doug Burgum, the Secretary of the Interior, onto Fox Business to talk about the change. I'm going to play a clip, but for my non-U.S. listeners, in the U.S., that position primarily deals with indigenous people and public lands like national parks. It's not like the Home Office in other countries. Okay, here's Burgum. Have a listen and tell me if you hear what is deceptive.
But CO2 was never a pollutant. When we breathe, we emit CO2. Plants need CO2 to survive and grow. They thrive with more CO2.
I feel like we need to tell the secretary to watch out for something called the appeal to nature fallacy. So in this, someone decides something is good or bad based on its perceived natural or unnatural qualities. Do you find it in nature? It must be harmless or even good. Someone who's using this logic is using the notion of natural as a basis for evaluating the value or the morality of something without considering objective evidence or logical reasoning. So, for example, sodium occurs naturally, but if you eat too much of it, it will kill you. Africanized bees are found in nature, but I don't want to be around them. You get the idea. So, yes, CO2 exists in nature, but without considering amounts and effects, you've fallen for this appeal to nature fallacy, and that is what Doug Burgum did in that clip. Okay, on to the main topic of the day. Recently, the Washington Post announced another round of layoffs, this one nearly half of the remaining staff. And I hate to say it, but those kind of headlines have become so common that it almost seems like it doesn't register anymore. but I think this one deserves a pause. The Post isn't the Dinkytown News. It's one of the most influential news organizations in the U.S. It has a deep bench of reporters and a long history of serious accountability journalism. They have the name and the gravitas to hold truth to power, and even it's shrinking. Now, prior to these layoffs, the staff was already down because of some buyout programs. And this included people like Philip Bump, a well-known reporter whose work helped readers make sense of politics through data, and Carol Leonnig, one of the journalists behind some of the Post's most important investigations of power over the whole last decade. And these seasoned journalists aren't replaceable because they're not just names. They're expertise and institutional memory. And that matters, not just for the journalists who are now out of a job, but for all of us. Because when an institution like the Washington Post cuts staff, it's not like news goes away, right? There's still trials, and Congress still tries to pass things, and businesses and nonprofits still affect people's lives. What changes is who's left to watch. It used to be that news organizations did the watching. There were companies, and they hired reporters to go sit at the courthouse of the city or county council so that you could find out what people you voted for were doing with your money, and about laws that might affect your life. News organizations paid salaries. They also provided editors and legal teams and time. And they absorbed risk so that individual reporters didn't have to carry it alone. But around the world, that system has been eroding for years. Advertisers, rationally, prefer the lower costs and targeted audiences that they can reach online. People do like to make money, but there is a limit to how much folks can pay for subscriptions, and subscription income never replaced ad income. Although owning a news outlet used to be very lucrative because you were the only way to tell people about your sale at the car lot at the grocery store, the calculus has really changed. And so newspapers and broadcast outlets started getting closed or sold to larger companies. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway owned 30 newspapers at one point. Jeff Bezos famously owns the Washington Post. And when it became too hard to increase income with advertising, the pressure to cut expenses increased, notably by cutting the people. So newsrooms were told to do more with less. And then less. And then less. So what do? Well, journalists adapted. Many of them had no choice, as some of them were laid off. Some of them took buyouts. Some of them saw the writing on the wall and they left before the next round of cuts. A lot of them work in marketing and PR now. And those who wanted to stay in journalism became freelancers, started newsletters, built audiences on social platforms, or began describing themselves as independent journalists. And so today we find that a huge and a growing share of journalism is now happening outside traditional institutions. When the Post had its recent layoffs, I saw a lot of people posting about how these staff would be starting Substacks or otherwise striking out on their own. And for a lot of people, I think that sounds hopeful. Corporate media companies like an ABC or a New York Times, they have their critics, and for some good reasons. They have obligations to the bottom line, either to shareholders or to parent companies. Disney owns ABC, if you didn't know. And the goal of a business is to make money, and this can lead to some bad behavior compared with the ideals of journalism. So audiences and commentators, often from independent journalism, see it as cleaner, more honest, free from corporate pressure and free from owners and editors chasing clicks. The idea is that if journalists aren't tied to big organizations, they can tell the truth more directly, and they can serve the public more fully. And sometimes that is true. But it's not just about whether independent journalists care about their work. Most of them do. And it's not even about if they're skilled or committed. Many of them are. But does this shift actually help the public be informed? Because journalism is not just about producing content. It's about producing information that people can rely on, and that actually takes a lot. It means verification, and context, and follow-up, and accountability, and those things just don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by the systems that journalists work inside. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll look at what happens to the news when journalism moves from institutions to individuals. I'll be right back. Welcome back. When journalism moves from institutions to individuals, the systems that provide things like accountability also change. And we need to understand that the risks and the rewards are both different for independent journalists. When newspaper jobs disappear, journalists don't stop being journalists. When Philip Bump left the Washington Post, he didn't suddenly lose his ability to analyze data. Carolyn Leonnig didn't stop understanding how power works, but their working conditions sure do change. Many freelancers now patch together income by getting assignments from or selling work to multiple outlets. Sometimes they're paid per story, sometimes they're paid by traffic, and sometimes they're paid late or not at all. A lot of them supplement their reporting with other work just to stay afloat. So they might teach, or they might write web copy, they might run social media accounts or produce video. Sometimes they're doing work sitting really uncomfortably close to public relations. And that's not a character flaw, it's just a labor reality because freelancing can be literal feast and famine. And that reality does shape information. If more journalism is being done by people without steady pay and without legal backing and without editors down the hall or institutional protection, what does that mean for the public? Do we get better information? And does being independent make a journalist more or less accountable to journalism ethics? Researchers have been asking versions of these questions for a while now. They've talked to freelancers about how they work, and they've studied characteristics of stories that get produced under different conditions. They've looked at how journalists present themselves when they no longer speak for an organization, and they've examined what happens to ethics when rules move from institutions to individuals. I wish there was a simple answer, but what they found is pretty complex. So let's break it down. Independence has a kind of a duality to it. It can mean your freedom to follow a story an editor might not see the value of right away, and it might give you the chance to report on it for months or years as long as it takes. But it can also mean exposure. So consider Don Lemon. Last month, federal agents arrested former CNN journalist Don Lemon after he live-streamed an immigration protest that moved inside a church in Minnesota. The White House social media account actually celebrated the moment online by posting his photo with a joke about his name and an emoji of chains. And in that way, it was kind of framing him not as a reporter, but as a criminal, someone who had joined a group that disrupted a Sunday service and violated worshippers' rights. Lemon said he was there to cover the protest and not to take part in it, and he pleaded not guilty to federal charges. But I want you to think about this for a second. Now that he's not with CNN, what makes Lemon a journalist? Is it that he live-streamed the protest and did not carry a sign or shout himself? Is that it? Because a lot of people who entered the Capitol on January 6th were also live-streaming. So are they journalists too? Before you decide I'm ridiculous and the answer is obvious, take a minute and consider how you might see the issue as someone with different views from yourself. You know, when I was a reporter, I had a printed press pass from the newspaper that I could use to show who I was. Today, you can buy press vests from Amazon for less than $20. Now, Lemon's trial will almost certainly raise the question of if an unaffiliated guy with a blog and a phone is actually a journalist. Like it or not, press credentials with a publishing or broadcasting outlet can really open doors, and being on your own can close them. So here's the question. As journalism moves out of newsrooms and onto individuals, does the public end up differently informed, less informed? If you listen to journalists who have gone independent, many of them describe it in similar terms. They definitely talk about freedom. So they're free from editors who want fast turnarounds, and they're free from meetings that eat up their day. They're free from assignments that are spinach journalism, like sitting in city council to write down that Cub Scout Pack 475 was honored. Maybe even free from owners whose priorities don't line up with public service. This is a global trend. And research on freelance journalists in countries like Norway shows that some people actively choose this path, even when staff jobs are available. Research participants described having more control over their time, more say in what they work on, the opportunity to do more long-form features or documentaries or niche topics that daily newsroom work often does not allow. And that matters because newsrooms don't always reward depth. When you're on a daily beat, your job is to keep up. You find out stuff, you write it up, you move on. There isn't a lot of time to sit with a topic or follow it over months or years unless an editor makes that space for that work. And because the number of reporters has shrunk so much, in newsrooms that space is really not likely. So freelancers can choose those stories, at least in theory. And some freelancers become experts in specific areas like climate or health or education or local government. And others build audiences around explaining things that have already happened rather than breaking the news. Because they take the time to walk people through complex issues, that kind of independent journalism can feel really refreshing. Freelancers can also be more innovative because for them, the cost of an unfortunate attempt may not be as high as it would be for a big organization. As news organizations have struggled, freelancers have often been the ones trying out new ways of reaching audiences. They try different platforms. They try different formats, like telling stories in a social media carousel. Some of them engage directly with their audience, building communities around their work on Substack or Patreon or social media. Research in the United States shows that editors often watch what freelancers are doing online and then they borrow those strategies for their own newsrooms. So in that sense, independent journalism sometimes acts like a testing ground for the industry. These journalists take risks that institutions are hesitant to take, and that can really help the public. New formats can get information to people who don't read traditional news. Being able to ask journalists questions can make journalism feel more accountable, and journalists with specialized topics can cover things that shrinking newsrooms just don't anymore, like religion or minority communities. Are freelance journalists professionals when it comes to journalism, though? Studies of how freelancers present themselves online show that they don't abandon journalistic ideals when they leave institutions. In fact, many of them work really hard to signal that they're serious. They talk about ethics, they highlight their experience, they downplay their personality because they want to be seen as credible, and this makes sense. When you don't have a newsroom behind you, your name becomes the brand. The audience has to trust the individual. So the hopeful version of this story goes something like this. As big newsrooms shrink, independent journalists step in. They bring expertise, flexibility, and innovation, and they serve audiences directly. They avoid some of the pressures that come with corporate ownership, and in doing so, they help the public to stay informed. And boy, that's a nice picture. It's not wrong, but it's also not the whole story. Because that same research also points to some issues with freelancers. While they do have some more freedom, they also have different kinds of constraints and temptations. Freedom from editors is great, but freelancers are always accountable to the market, and motivation doesn't always line up with accountability. To understand the limits of independent journalism, we need to talk about money and time. And it's not because journalists are greedy, it's because journalism does take resources. Across multiple countries, researchers studying freelance journalists keep finding the same pattern. When journalists work under unstable conditions, it shapes the kind of information that they can produce. In Ireland, researchers interviewed freelance journalists and then looked at the work they published, and most of it fell into a narrow range: breaking news, court coverage, daily events, and short pieces based on official statements or press releases. Now, these are important stories that tell the public what just happened, but they're also what my students call quick hit stories. They're fast to produce, they're pretty safe. So what wasn't there? Some of those things we just said were more possible for freelancers: long investigations, deep accountability stories, work that required weeks of reporting, or willingness to anger powerful people. It's not because freelancers don't want to do them. They're not there because freelancers can't afford to do them. Many of the journalists they interviewed said the same thing in different ways. They couldn't spend weeks on a story they might never sell. They couldn't wait months for a Freedom of Information request to come back. They couldn't risk legal trouble without knowing who would pay the bill, so they made practical choices. They focused on stories they knew editors would reliably buy. They avoided topics that might create conflict with sources that they needed for future work, and they learned over time which risks they could manage and which ones they could not. And while these are obviously rational choices, this is where the idea that independence automatically leads to better journalism kind of breaks down. Because when journalists leave institutions, they don't leave pressure behind, that pressure just moves with them. So instead of answering to a newsroom, freelancers often answer to markets or platforms or audiences. If you're paid by the story, you start thinking about what you can sell. If your income depends on clicks or views, you'll start paying attention to what engages really fast. And if your work lives on social platforms, you start thinking about what the algorithm rewards. It's basic survival. Researchers in Australia found that freelance journalists still strongly identified as professionals. They believe in public service. They believe in accuracy. But they also describe learning what they call the rules of the game. They knew what editors wanted. They knew which stories were welcome and which would quietly go nowhere. And if they didn't have the security of a regular paycheck, pushing against those rules was more risk than reward. In Norway, freelancers described something similar. But in more personal terms, many chose freelancing because they wanted control over their time so they could work on stories they found meaningful. But at the same time, they described constant stress around income. They also saw payments declining and contracts becoming informal or verbal. They were pressured to take assignments even when they were exhausted or sick, because saying no might mean not being asked again. They were looking for freedom, but instead they found a whole lot of negotiation. Negotiation with their editors over pay and scope of a story. Negotiations with platforms over visibility, and negotiations with audiences over tone and focus. And even negotiation with themselves over which compromises they could make. And that negotiation, it shapes your journalism. You might identify an issue, but you don't have time to dig into it. You might reshare someone's claim in a meeting or a press conference, but you never get to go back and check if it's true. Financial precarity can mean that you can't afford to hire lawyers. In practice, this means you cannot report things that might get you sued. And I'd like to think that people wouldn't bring a lawsuit over reporting that is true but unflattering, but present times show that the rich and the powerful are definitely using the courts to intimidate journalists, even bringing cases that they know they will lose. So as more journalists are pushed into freelancing, the powerful lose their need to be accountable. Stories that require confrontation or persistence or legal backing, it's just harder to justify that to yourself. So it's just safer to stay closer to the official narratives. An independent journalist has to find their own audience. So when your survival depends on visibility, attention becomes a form of currency. Stories that are buzzy get repeated. deep dive stories that are complex can be hard to complete. So, over time, journalists learn what keeps audiences engaged, not because they want to manipulate anyone, but because engagement keeps them working. And the result is an information environment that looks busy and full, but maybe thinner than it looks. You see more posts and commentary and less digging into issues and following stories to the end. So here's the question. What happens to ethics and accountability and trust when journalism becomes individual instead of institutional? That's where we're going next. Be right back. When journalism happens inside institutions, ethics are a group project. Newsrooms write codes of conduct, editors challenge how a story is framing, or if you looked at all the sides, lawyers might review your copy and look at the risk. Reporters argue with each other over wording. And these conversations slow stories down, but they also catch mistakes and they limit harm. When journalism moves onto individuals, that system weakens. You see, it's not that freelance journalists stop caring about ethics. The problem is that they can't carry that burden by themselves. The financial issues are really real. Researchers studying freelance journalists in Sweden found that many freelancers regularly move between journalism and other kinds of information work, including PR and promotional content. Does this cross an ethical line? It might. Does it look like it might? Well, yeah, it does. And they do it because journalism by itself often doesn't pay enough to survive. And there's a real tension there, freelancers creating their own rules to manage it. They decide which clients they will work for, they avoid covering topics that are tied to that paid promotional work they do on the side. They try to protect their integrity, but what if they're doing in those rules, they stay private. Audiences can't see them, and there's no editors to enforce them. So ethics move from institutions to individuals, and it is us, the audience, who now has to decide who is worth our trust. And of course, it matters most when something goes wrong. In Minnesota, a man named Nick Shirley built a large online following while calling himself an independent journalist. His video about childcare fraud in Minnesota spread quickly and shaped how many people understood what happened. The day after Christmas last year, Shirley posted a 42-minute video on X and YouTube, which depicted him visiting several daycare centers in Minneapolis run by Somali Americans. He was alleging that these were ghost daycares, and they were taking in millions of dollars in government money but weren't actually watching any kids. He put in things like blacked out windows and empty buildings as proof. But investigators and news outlets later found that a lot of his claims were really misleading. For example, he filmed centers that serve parents on night shifts or that had already closed for the day. One staff member said that Shirley showed up with a group of masked men, and no daycare director in their right mind is going to let unknown people into the daycare when there are children there. But the video did well. It went so viral that it actually changed how the federal government treats Minnesota. The Department of Health and Human Services froze childcare payments to investigate the fraud claims, and the administration used the video to justify new reporting requirements for states that receive federal childcare money, and that makes it harder for low-income families to get help. Possibly most importantly, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI sent agents to Minnesota to look for fraud, and this included the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, surge that is occupying a lot of the news attention in the country right now. Shirley published his work without an editor reviewing it beforehand. There was no standards desk to question his framing or his methods. His accountability arrived later, through outside reporting, and not through the reporting process itself. And this is one risk of individualized journalism. Influence grows faster than oversight does. But independence creates another kind of risk as well. You can think about people like Don Lemon. Now, we know Don Lemon is an experienced journalist with decades in the field, but without the backing of a major newsroom, he lacked the institutional protection that reporters often rely on. Large news organizations carry weight, and police departments and governments recognize those press passes that they give out. When journalists work alone, that protection disappears. Researchers in other countries see this dynamic play out even more starkly. For example, in Zimbabwe, state agents routinely harass freelance journalists because they don't work for recognized organizations. Authorities dismiss them as illegitimate. And so in those settings, independence doesn't create freedom, it just creates exposure. It doesn't remove risks, it just moves them around. And that outcome does not serve the public. Institutions don't guarantee ethical journalism, but they do create shared systems for correction and responsibility. Individual journalism replaces those systems with personal judgment and after-the-fact scrutiny, and that affects how the audience can trust them, because the audience now has to decide on their own which independent journalists follow professional standards. They use a variety of things, tone and confidence and repetition, as symbols of credibility, But honestly, visibility often stands in for verification. If you see someone a lot and they seem smart, you assume they are informed. And because platforms reward engagement, the most prominent voices are often the ones best at attracting attention, not the best ones at slowing down and doing a careful job. So we get back to that core question. If journalism continues to move toward freelancers, does that help the public understand the world more clearly? Are independent journalists the answer? Well, after everything we've looked at, the most honest answer is no. But they aren't the problem either. Independent and freelance journalists have stepped into the gaps left by shrinking newsrooms. They fill those coverage holes, they try new formats, they reach audiences that legacy media often misses. In a lot of cases, they produce work that would not even exist otherwise. But at the same time, independence shifts all the pressure on to individuals. It turns accountability into something that often happens after harm and not before it. Now, this doesn't automatically leave the public less informed, but it does place more responsibility on you, truth seekers. So it helps to ask a different question. What should we, in the audience, pay attention to now? There's a few things worth watching. First, watch for follow-through. When you encounter reporting from an independent journalist, notice whether they revisit the stories they start. Do they update their work? Do they explain what changed? Or do they move on once the post performs well? Second, notice how journalists carry risk. There's some stories that have little danger. Others invite pushback from powerful people or institutions, and newsrooms often absorb that risk for their staff, but independent journalists often can't. If you notice a journalist avoiding certain topics or targets, that choice may not reflect a lack of commitment, it may reflect a lack of protection. And understanding that helps explain what's missing. And third, pay attention to how journalists signal credibility. If you're inside an institution, credibility comes from the organization, but outside them, journalists have to create it themselves. Those signals don't guarantee accuracy. When you evaluate independent journalism, you got to look beyond performance. Maybe check a second source if you can. Notice whether journalists correct mistakes. Pay attention to whether they explain when they're uncertain instead of hiding it. And remember that more information does not equal better information. A loud information environment can feel informed, but it can still leave questions unanswered. Speed and volume are not the same thing as understanding. So sometimes staying informed means slowing down, taking the time to compare the coverage, or paying attention to what doesn't get covered as much as what does. Independent journalism is going to continue, and it's going to continue to shape how we learn about the world. That trend isn't going away. And the real question is not whether independence is good or bad. It's whether we recognize what independence changes. Because when journalism changes shape, the audience's work of understanding it changes too. And that is why media literacy matters now more than ever. And I'm going to close with just a little personal note. If you've enjoyed Getting Unspun, I would appreciate it if you would leave a rating and review on the podcast platform where you're listening right now. I am also independent, and I depend on the algorithms like everyone, so your ratings help push media literacy into people's feeds. Thanks for listening, and stay sharp, everyone. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone. It's no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, Unspun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to Unspun today. Unspun, because you deserve the truth.
History is messy. It's weird, wild, and anything but boring. Rainy Day Rabbit Holes is a history podcast about unhinged stories that make you stop and ask, wait, is this real life?
From crazy disasters and tasty scandals to enlightening and surprising heartwarming tales, we explore the moments where people behave badly and sometimes beautifully.
We've got naughty politicians, cultural chaos, and a deep love for the Pacific Northwest, including Bigfoot.
It's thoughtful, irreverent, occasionally serious, and always entertaining.
Let's fall down the rabbit hole.
MSW Media.